The Teal Room. A Conversation with Peter Thiel at the Edge of the Republic. By Elias Winter. June 11th, 2026. Read by an automated voice. Author's note: this essay is a work of imaginative political satire. The conversation depicted here is fictional. Peter Thiel did not meet with the narrator, and the dialogue is invented as a literary device. References to public events, companies, and reported facts are used for commentary and interpretation. Prologue. The invitation came without a country. The invitation arrived in an envelope without a return address. This was already suspicious. No serious person sends an envelope anymore unless he's either getting married, suing you, or trying to make his apocalypse feel artisanal. Inside was a boarding pass, a thin white card, and a note printed in a font that had clearly been selected by someone who believed God had poor taste. Mr. Winter, Mr. Thiel will see you between jurisdictions. There was no city listed, no airport, no country. Only a gate number, Gate 0. I turned the card over. On the back, in smaller print, it said, "Please bring only one passport. Mr. Thiel will bring several." I laughed, then felt sad, which is how I knew the invitation was real. The next thing I remember, I was standing inside a private terminal that seemed to have been designed by a hedge fund after reading the Book of Revelation. There were no national flags. Or rather, there were flags, but they had been folded behind glass like rare wine labels. Argentina, New Zealand, Malta, the United States, Uruguay. Nations displayed not as homes, but as instruments. The floor was polished stone. The chairs were low and expensive. The coffee tasted like it had been extracted from a bean that had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Men in soft jackets moved quietly through the lounge, speaking in the sacred language of the new priesthood. Residency, exposure, optionality, sovereign risk, tax efficiency, downside protection. No one said home. No one said people. No one said soil. At the far end of the room, near a window that looked out onto no visible runway, sat Peter Thiel. He looked exactly as he always looked in photographs, like someone had promised him immortality and delivered a Democratic committee. He did not rise. "Mr. Winter," he said. "Mr. Thiel," I said. "It's pronounced Teal." "I know. You wrote it wrong in your head." "I did," I said. "I keep thinking teal, like the color." He frowned. "Teal is what happens when blue loses faith in itself," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You write essays, don't you?" "Unfortunately." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Then sit. I assume you've come to accuse me of something." "No," I said. "I've come to understand why the father bought another house." For the first time, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had discovered a flaw in your premise and planned to monetize it. 1. The man who mistook limits for insults. "You think I'm leaving America," he said. "Are you?" "No, that is how journalists think. They mistake movement for abandonment." "What should I call it? Preparation. For what?" "Instability." He said the word cleanly, almost gently, the way a surgeon says incision. Outside the window, a plane lifted into the colorless sky. "America is unstable," he continued. "The institutions are decaying. The universities are corrupt. The political system is unserious. The state is bloated and incompetent. The culture is exhausted. The technological frontier has narrowed. The regulatory environment punishes ambition. Why would a rational person not create options?" "Because a father repairs the house," I said. He tilted his head. "A father also evacuates his children if the house is on fire." "That depends," I said. "Did he set the fire?" He did not answer immediately. This was the first thing I noticed about him. He did not mind silence. Ordinary people fill silence because they fear being misunderstood. Powerful men preserve silence because they assume interpretation is your burden. I did not create American decline, he said finally. No single man does. Then your metaphor fails. No, I said. It matures. He leaned back. You are going to make this theological. You made it theological first. You complain about democracy, universities, technology, death, the state, taxes, California, politics itself. At a certain point, the complaint is no longer policy. It becomes metaphysics. Metaphysics is what people invoke when they have lost the argument, or when the argument has finally reached the basement. He looked amused. Go on. You experience limits as insults. That is a slogan. It is an observation. Most limits are artificial, he said. Most limits are excuses invented by people who fear excellence. Democracy limits freedom. Bureaucracy limits invention. Universities limit thought. Regulation limits builders. Politics limits the competent by giving veto power to the mediocre. Why should limits be treated as sacred simply because they exist? They shouldn't, I said. Some limits are prisons. Exactly. But some limits are roots. He blinked. Trees, he said with mild contempt. Yes. Trees are not a model for civilization. No, I said. But they are a model for life. He looked away. This, I thought, was the first wound. Not that he hated roots exactly, but that he believed roots were chains that had not yet received adequate venture funding. 2. The soil and the spreadsheet. I have lived in many countries, I told him. Iran, France, Canada, Germany, Ireland, America. I know something about floating. That should make you sympathetic. It makes me precise. Meaning? There are different kinds of floating. He waited. Capital floats upward, I said. Exile floats because the ground keeps moving. He stared at me with the expression of a man trying to decide whether a sentence was profound or merely inefficient. I did not float because I had purchased distance from obligation, I said. I floated because history had broken the map under my feet. I moved through countries as a child, student, immigrant, worker, foreigner, almost citizen, almost belonging. I learned the smell of airports. I learned the humiliation of forms. I learned how quickly a human being becomes a file. I learned how many times you can introduce yourself before the self begins to sound like a translation. That is sentimental, he said. Yes, I said. That is one of the ways you know it concerns human beings. He crossed one leg over the other. I moved too, he said. Germany, the United States, Southern Africa, California. Mobility is not unique to capital. No, I said, but capital turns mobility into immunity. He smiled again. You dislike efficiency. I dislike efficiency when it begins eating nouns. Nouns? Home, duty, neighbor, citizen, child, dead, soil. Soil again. Yes, soil again. A tree is limited by the soil of its roots. It cannot drink from everywhere. But that limit is not humiliation. It is nourishment. It is how the tree knows where to draw water from. Men are not trees, he said. Men can choose. Exactly, which means refusal matters. He looked at the folded flags behind glass. I think you are confusing rootedness with stagnation. And I think you are confusing compounding with living. For the first time, his face changed. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But something in the mouth tightened. Compounding is how civilization advances. Compounding is how money grows, I said. Civilization advances when power accepts obligation. That sounds noble, he said. Historically, it is mostly false. Historically, everything noble is mostly false. That does not absolve us from needing the standard. He sighed. This was the second thing I noticed about him. His boredom had moral content. He did not merely tire of arguments, he tired of claims, especially claims made by anything that could not buy equity. 3. The Founding Fathers were rich too. You know, I said, America's first fathers were rich too. I'm aware. Landowners, lawyers, merchants, planters, creditors, slaveholders, men of property, men of rank. They were not the poor rising spontaneously from the soil to author a republic. They were the elites of their world. So why romanticize them? I don't. You just called them fathers. America did. A mistake. Maybe, but mistakes reveal desire. The country called them fathers because it needed to imagine elite power as stewardship. It needed to believe that the men with land, education, law, weapons, and wealth were bound to the fate of the thing they built. They were also hypocrites. Of course, some owned human beings while writing about liberty. The founding was stained at birth. But hypocrisy is not the absence of morality. It is morality betrayed. And betrayal still tells you what the standard was. He tapped one finger against the arm of his chair. You believe elites owe the nation paternity. I believe elites who build wealth from a nation owe it stewardship. Stewardship is often a word used by the less competent to supervise the more competent. Sometimes, I said. And sometimes freedom is a word used by the more powerful to escape the people who made their freedom possible. He did not respond. I continued. Imagine Washington after the war. Imagine him saying, "The republic appears unstable. Democracy is risky. The people are irrational. I have therefore purchased a large estate in a distant hemisphere and obtained alternative citizenship under exceptional circumstances. Good luck with the experiment." Thiel's eyes narrowed. That would have been prudent. I laughed. There it was. The whole republic cracked open in a joke. Yes, I said. Exactly. You confuse myth with reality. No, I am saying myth is the last form reality takes before it becomes a corpse. He looked at me with something like interest. The old father may have been cruel, I said. He may have been compromised. He may have loved only some of his children, but at least the myth required him to stand near the house. The new father builds payment systems, surveillance systems, venture funds, political networks, ideological escape hatches, and then, when the house trembles, he buys another soil. You keep saying father, yes? Why? Because America does. I did not ask to be made into a father. No, I said. You only accepted the inheritance. 4. PayPal, Palantir, Facebook, and other ways of harvesting the commons. Where did your money come from? I asked. He looked almost relieved. This was safer territory. Money is where metaphysics goes to become respectable. Risk, he said. Judgment, timing, concentration. Contrarian thinking, building when others doubted, investing before consensus. All true, I said. He seemed disappointed. You expected me to deny your gifts? Most critics do. They're lazy. You're not stupid. That is what makes this worse. He smiled faintly. PayPal, I said. A payments company that monetized trust on a public internet built through decades of state-backed research, public standards, legal infrastructure, banking systems, courts, consumer behavior, merchants, fraud enforcement, and digital commerce. You could say that about any internet company. Yes, then the point is meaningless. No, it is universal. He said nothing. Facebook, I continued. A private claim on the social lives of millions, then billions. Friendship converted into inventory. Loneliness converted into engagement. Family photos, political rage, birthdays, grief, envy, desire, attention, all made available to advertisers. You saw the door early. You walked through it. You became rich because human beings wanted to be seen. Facebook connected people. Yes, I said. That is why it could monetize them. He gave me a dry look. You are good at making all verbs sound criminal. No, only the ones that forget their objects. He said nothing. Palantir, I said. Data integration for the state, intelligence, defense, public budgets, public fear, public data, public violence. The states need to see its enemies, its citizens, its migrants, its risks, its threats, its inventories, its populations. A company that helps power see. That is childish, he said. Institutions need tools. Governments need software. The world is dangerous. Data saves lives. Yes, I said. And data can also make cruelty legible enough to scale. He looked at me coldly. You prefer incompetence? No, I prefer asking who becomes more vulnerable when competence has no mercy. He leaned forward. Do you know how many lives are lost because systems fail? Because agencies cannot share information? Because bureaucracies are blind? Yes, I said. And do you know how many lives are shattered when the state sees too well and loves too little? The terminal seemed to darken, though the lights did not change. I continued more quietly. Founders Fund, venture capital, startups, public research, universities, immigrant labor, patent law, securities law, courts, federal science, defense procurement, GPS, the long, boring, publicly funded floor beneath private acceleration. He looked impatient. You are describing civilization. Everyone uses civilization. Few people build anything with it. That is your best argument, I said. He waited. You did build. You took risks. You saw early. You helped create real things. I am not here to pretend otherwise. Then what is the accusation? That you mistake private title for solitary creation. His face closed. The money had roots, I said, even if the man did not. He looked toward the window. The soil was public, the fruit was private, the escape was personal. He sighed. Poetry is not accounting. No, I said, accounting is what people invented to avoid poetry's audit. 5. The Child with the Spider-Man Backpack. There was a child, I said. There is always a child in essays like this, he replied. Yes, that is because adults keep building machines that require children to explain them. He folded his hands. Go on. A migrant child, a father, a school morning, a backpack, maybe Spider-Man, maybe some other hero licensed by a company large enough to survive every republic. The child is taken into the machinery, detention, transfer, hearing, removal, processing. You are collapsing many cases into an image. I am using an image to reveal the structure. States have borders. Yes. Borders require enforcement. Yes. Compassion without structure becomes sentimentality. Yes. He seemed surprised. You agree? I agree that states have borders. I agree that systems require rules. I agree that a country cannot exist as pure feeling. But I'm asking a different question. What question? Why does the border become a wall for the poor and a turnstile for the rich? He looked away. At the top, the family relocates, I said. At the bottom, the family is processed. That is rhetoric. It is also administration. He shifted in his chair. Do you believe there should be no distinction between legal and illegal movement? I believe the distinction becomes obscene when the same civilization celebrates billionaire mobility as wisdom and criminalizes desperate mobility as invasion. You are moralizing asymmetry. I am describing it. People cannot simply cross borders because they suffer. Rich people do. They invest, they apply, they comply with law. They buy the version of law that has a concierge. He almost smiled. That is unfair. Yes, I said. That is exactly the point. A woman in a gray uniform passed silently with a tray of water glasses. Neither of us took one. You can move your household across continents as protection, I said. A migrant father moves his household across a border and becomes evidence. Your children enter a private school. His child enters a detention complex. You choose a country. He's assigned one by the state. You make me responsible for all suffering. No, I make you responsible for what your class refuses to see. My class? The men who convert the public world into private sovereignty and then call the public world broken. He looked genuinely annoyed now. You want confession. No, confession would be too easy. I want recognition. Of what? That you did not build the cage alone, but you helped build a world in which cages became software. The silence after that was different. Not victory, not defeat. Only the sound of a plane somewhere beyond the glass preparing to leave. 6. The complaint department at the end of history. List them, I said. List what? Your complaints. He looked at me as if this were childish, which it was, but not therefore wrong. I don't have complaints. I have diagnoses. Of course, the aristocratic complaint always wears a lab coat. He ignored that. Democracy has become dysfunctional. Higher education is a bubble. Technological progress has stagnated. The state is inefficient. California is badly governed. The West lacks ambition. Science has become too bureaucratic. The culture punishes excellence. Political correctness degraded universities. Mortality remains an unsolved problem. Artificial intelligence may not be enough. Global governance risks tyranny. The future is trapped. As he spoke, a receipt began emerging from a small machine beside his chair. I had not noticed the machine before. The receipt kept printing. Democracy. Taxes. Universities. California. Death. Regulation. Bureaucracy. Stagnation. Google. China. The body. The mob. The mediocre. The state. The public. The present. The future for failing to arrive on schedule. The receipt rolled across the floor, past my shoes, beneath the table, toward a cleaning woman who quietly stepped over it with the practiced dignity of someone who has spent a lifetime stepping over the complaints of men. You see, he said, these are real problems. Yes. Then why mock them? Because your complaint is larger than the problems. He frowned. Your grievance is not that America failed, I said. Your grievance is that reality did not submit. That is absurd. Is it? Dissatisfaction built civilization. Yes, I said, but gratitude keeps it human. He looked at me as if gratitude were a minor virtue, suitable for nurses, widows, and people who write handwritten notes. Gratitude is often complacency. No, gratitude is memory with manners. He did not laugh. Dissatisfaction can build, I said. Of course it can. Hunger builds, ambition builds, refusal builds, rage builds. The problem is appetite without debt. Appetite that receives a world and calls it inadequate. Appetite that harvests a nation and calls it hostile. Appetite that profits from the common inheritance and then complains that the inheritance did not include immortality. Death is a technical problem. Death is also why love hurries. He stared at me. You wanted flying cars, I said. We gave you comment sections, erectile dysfunction ads, collapsing bridges, a Congress that looked assembled by carbon monoxide, and a public that could no longer tell whether it was informed or merely stimulated. That seems like a case for my view. Yes, I said. That is the irritating thing. You are not always wrong. He looked pleased. You are often right about the wound, I said, but wrong about the obligation created by seeing it. The receipt printer stopped. The last line read, "Insufficient world." I picked it up. There it is, I said. What? The whole theology. 7. A life from which nothing can ask anything. Imagine you won, I said. At what? At everything. No limits, no taxes you disliked, no democratic obstruction, no bureaucracy, no failing universities, no death, no borders except the ones you chose, no obligations except voluntary ones, no public claims on private genius, no slow people, no committees, no body that betrayed you, no country that disappointed you, no soil that held you in place. He watched me carefully. What would life be for? Creation, he said. Of what? More intelligence, more possibility, more life. Possibility is not meaning, I said. Possibility is the room before meaning enters. That is a writer's prejudice. Yes, writers know something about form. Form is not limit. Form is chosen limit. He looked tired now. I continued. Love limits, children limit, language limits, art limits, sobriety limits, a promise limits, a country limits, a body limits, death limits. The question is not whether limits are good. Some are cruel, some must be broken. The question is whether a life without any claim upon it would still be a life. He said nothing. A life without limits is not freedom, I said. It is a life from which nothing can ask anything. Outside the glass, the sky had turned the color of old metal. If nothing can ask anything of you, then nothing can love you. He looked at me then, not sharply, not defensively, almost sadly. Or perhaps I wanted him to look sad because I needed the man to remain human. The dream of escaping all limits, I said, is finally the dream of escaping love. He turned toward the window. You think belonging is salvation? No, I said. I think belonging is the wound through which salvation becomes possible. He gave a small laugh. That is very Elias Winter. It is a serious medical condition. For a moment, something softened. Then it passed. 8. The father explains himself. You keep returning to fatherhood, he said. Yes. You know I have children. Yes. You know I am married. Yes. You know that moving a family can be an act of care. Yes. Then let me ask plainly. If you had children and you believed the country around them was unstable, violent, indebted, politically irrational, institutionally decayed, and increasingly hostile to the future, would you not protect them? I did not answer quickly. This was his strongest defense. Not democracy, not taxes, not technology, not exit, not even genius. Children. A father moving his children away from danger is not inherently wicked. A parent who sees risk and prepares is not automatically an oligarchic villain. One of the cheap habits of political writing is to deny your opponent his human motive, because once you grant it, the cartoon dies and the argument has to grow a spine. Of course, I said. He nodded once as if the case were closed. That is why this is sad, I continued. Not simple. He watched me. The sin is not that you love your children. The sin is that your love has a private jet and no public equivalent. His face hardened. That is a ridiculous sentence. No, it is the sentence. I am not obligated to solve everyone's problems because I have resources. No, but you are obligated not to confuse your ability to escape with moral innocence. He looked away. You want me to stay in a failing system to perform solidarity? No. I want the men who profit from systems to stop treating exit as innocence. He shook his head. You keep saying men who profit. Everyone profits. Workers profit. Consumers profit. Users profit. Governments profit. This moral economy of yours is too vague. Fine, I said. Let us make it concrete. The migrant father also loves his child. He crosses because the world behind him has become unlivable. He is not moving for tax efficiency or ideological experimentation. He is moving because staying may destroy the child. Yet his fatherhood is treated as suspicion. Yours is treated as strategy. That is because the law distinguishes between forms of movement. The law also once distinguished between forms of personhood. He said nothing. The problem is not paternal love, I said. The problem is the distribution of escape. He looked at his hands. For the first time, I wondered if he was tired. Not publicly tired. Not the theatrical fatigue of the over-interviewed billionaire. Actually tired. The kind of tired that comes from having built a private shelter so elaborate that one can no longer tell whether it protects life or replaces it. 9. Second passport theology. Tell me about New Zealand, I said. He gave me a look. Must we? Yes, it is a beautiful country. That is not why it matters. No? No, it matters because for ordinary migrants, citizenship is recognition. For billionaires, citizenship becomes redundancy. He smiled dryly. You prefer people not prepare for risk. I prefer preparation that remembers obligation. He looked around the lounge. Countries compete for talent and capital. That is reality. Yes, and human beings compete for recognition, safety, and papers. That is also reality. Again, you equate unlike things. No, I contrast them. Behind him, the folded New Zealand flag sat in its glass case like an artifact from a future that had already been securitized. A passport, I said, used to mean membership in a people. Imperfectly, violently, unevenly, but still. Now for the rich, it becomes insurance. A home becomes a hedge. A bunker becomes theology. A country becomes a backup drive. Preparation is not sin. No, but preparation without obligation becomes desertion. He said nothing. The poor build routes so they cannot be deported. The rich buy routes so they can disappear. He looked at me sharply. That is good, he said. I know. You're pleased with yourself. Briefly, then I remember the sentence is true. A man in a dark suit approached Thiel and whispered something. Thiel nodded. The man withdrew. Argentina, I said. What about it? A country with its own suffering, its own history, its own wounds, its own poor, its own inflationary ghosts, its own political theater. But to the global elite, it becomes a concept, a libertarian experiment, a jurisdictional opportunity, a place where the father can test another future. You romanticize nations. No, I mourn their conversion into products. He looked almost angry. Nations are often prisons. Yes, I said, and they are also the only scale at which ordinary people can still make claims. That is changing. I know, I said. That is why we are here. 10. The genius that would not kneel. I don't want to pretend you have done nothing good, I said. How generous. I mean it. He looked skeptical. You saw things early. You helped build PayPal. You saw Facebook before others understood what it would become. Palantir solved real technical problems. Founders Fund backed ambitious companies. You have criticized stagnation when many people were content to scroll inside decline. You have asked large questions in an age addicted to small answers. He waited. You have genius, I said, or something near enough to it that the distinction is not useful. And yet genius is not stewardship. He looked down. Innovation asks, what can be built? Stewardship asks, whose suffering will this reduce? That is too narrow a view of innovation. No, it is the moral completion of innovation. He sighed. Philanthropy is full of waste. Public interest projects are often captured. Government systems are dysfunctional. Compassionate bureaucracy becomes theater. Most attempts to help become self-congratulation. Then build better mercy. He looked up. There it was again, the brief flicker of contact. Build better mercy, I repeated. You build systems. Build systems that make cruelty harder. Build software that helps migrants find lawyers instead of helping states find migrants. Build tools that make medical debt less predatory. Build addiction treatment infrastructure that actually works. Build public interest technology worthy of the name. Build humane bureaucracy. Build case systems that do not swallow families. Build housing finance that does not reduce shelter to an asset game. Build something that kneels. Kneels, he said. Yes. I dislike that word. I know. It implies submission. No, it implies service. To whom? To those who cannot repay you. He smiled without warmth. That is not how scale works. No, that is how love works. He looked away. A genius who cannot kneel, I said, will eventually build towers, not shelters. There was a long silence. Then he said quietly, You want saints? No, I said. I want adults. 11. The Teal Room. By then, the room had begun to change. Or perhaps I was only beginning to see it. Everything was teal, the glass, the carpet, the light around the folded flags, the reflection of the sky, the small screen announcing departures to cities that may or may not have existed. Teal, neither blue nor green, neither sea nor forest, neither country nor sky. A color for expensive rootlessness, a color for wellness clinics where no one was well, a color for airport lounges, private healthcare brochures, meditation apps funded by men who had never been still, and the glowing dashboard of a car that could drive itself but had nowhere sacred to go. Thiel, he said. What? You are thinking Teal again. I am. My name is Thiel. Of course. But in my mind, he remained Teal, not the man, the condition. The Teal Room was the place where nations lost their gravity, where passports became instruments, where fatherhood became logistics, where citizenship became redundancy, where complaint became philosophy, where the future was always elsewhere, where no one needed to hate the poor because the poor had already been abstracted into policy exposure. A cleaner entered the room and began gathering the long complaint receipt from the floor. She moved carefully, without resentment. This is one of the humiliations of ordinary goodness. It rarely has time to dramatize itself. It simply bends down and restores the world after the important have finished explaining why the world disappointed them. Do you know her name? I asked. Thiel looked at the woman. No. Neither do I said. That is part of the problem. The woman lifted the receipt. It had tangled around a chair leg. For a moment, she looked at the last line. Insufficient world. Then she tore it off and threw it away. 12. The house still stands. His flight was called without being announced. Important men do not hear announcements. The world lowers its voice around them. He stood. Mr. Winter, he said, Mr. Thiel, you have made a beautiful case. That sounds like an insult. It is not. But not a convincing one. He adjusted his jacket. I think you underestimate decay, he said. I think you underestimate debt. To whom? I looked toward the glass, toward the folded flags, toward the invisible runway, toward the cleaner, toward the men speaking softly in tax treaties. To the world that made you possible. He nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the sentence had completed itself. Then he left. Men like that always board before you do. I remained in the Teal Room until the glass stopped reflecting him. Then I walked out of the private terminal and into the ordinary airport, where the Republic, in all its humiliation, was still alive. There were people sleeping on luggage, a mother feeding a child from a paper cup, A man arguing gently with an airline employee in a language neither of them fully trusted. A cleaner pushing a cart. A soldier looking at his phone. A grandmother holding a plastic bag full of food from home. A child wearing a superhero backpack. A young woman crying silently near the charging station. A janitor changing the trash. A taxi driver waiting beside a sign with someone else's name. A man on a video call saying, "I landed. I'm here. I'm here." No one in that room floated above nations. They carried nations in their mouths, their documents, their accents, their debts, their children, their fears, their medications, their missed connections, their names. The house was still burning. The fathers had not all stayed. Some had purchased other houses. Some had acquired second passports. Some had mistaken every route for a chain and every claim for an insult. But the house still stood because ordinary people kept standing inside it. Not because they were pure, not because they were innocent, not because the country deserved their love, but because they had nowhere else to place the children. And perhaps that is how stewardship returns after abandonment. Not through the fathers who flee, but through the children who remain long enough to repair what they did not break. A tree cannot grow everywhere. A man cannot love from nowhere. And a nation cannot survive fathers who mistake every root for a chain. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.